good, Yugioh? It's me, my boy Squid back in another Squid AO. So I have a list of cards that I actually think might be decently good in the upcoming new year with the new set releasing for Maze of Millennia as well as Phantom Nightmare. There are a lot of crazy new combos coming out. And I think these cards happen to be decently good that you guys should maybe consider picking them up. Or let me know what you think below in the comments. Starting at the top, Shared Ride. So this is a card that says for the rest of the turn, each time a card is added from the main deck or the graveyard to your opponent's hand, except by drawing them, you immediately draw one card. This is a type of card that would obviously be sided in going first, and it's highly effective against decks that do a lot of adding. For example, a lot of the Snake Eyes stuff, as well as the Fire Kings decks. Like, these decks are always adding. You know, you can chain it to something that adds like a Pot of Prosperity as well. So technically, even though this excavates, it's still adding from deck, so you immediately get to draw a card. It's effectively a pseudo max C that you can chain to any effect that adds a card from their deck to their hand. And then from there, you're able to lock them down for the rest of your turn by being able to draw into more hand traps the more adding they do. Now, obviously, this is nowhere nearly as good as max C, but this is all we got in the TCG right now. And I think it's one of the effective side options going first that you can kind of use it to make your hand a lot better defensively because you're drawing into more cards. It's not like a card like Summon Limit or like Solemn Judgment, which are equally, you know, as good in certain scenarios. But the issue is when you don't have a good hand that can prevent your opponent from potentially removing that continuous trap card, because nowadays there are a lot of things like SP Little Knight that just makes it really easy to remove stuff, and you can't optimally activate cards. But Shared Ride means that you can just like chain this to whatever. You can chain it to removal like Cosmic Cyclone as well, and then it puts them under a blanket. So it's kind of a cool card. I don't know if it's highly effective to the point where it's super high impact, but it's just a card that I thought was kind of neat. You can obviously use it against a lot of the other fire decks as well. Airlifter, Rescue Ace, and the other guys, the Hydrant that add. This is just a card that I thought was decently good. You know, it's in and out of the format, and this might just be the format where there's a lot of adding. It works really well against heavy combo decks like Vanadium as well. So this is potentially something you guys can experiment with, and let me know what you think. Next, Akin the Shared Ride is, instead of actually adding, we can play Mistaken Arrest, which prevents adding permanently for the rest of the turn. Now, the caveat is it also restricts you on your following turn. It's not just one turn, right? It's both turns. So that's just one thing to be aware of. But this card is especially useful because you can just stop them from adding, period. So there's certain decks that actually rely heavily on adding, depending on how they open, right, with their hand. If they're going like Pot of Prosperity and you actually chain the Mistaken Arrest, then that can just be huge, devastating to them because it stops the Pot of Prosperity. So you get the 1-for-1 trade. And then on top of that, they're not able to add for the rest of the turn. So nothing is going to fire off. A lot of times people are going to be playing Bonfire, which is a powerful card that allows you to add a level 4 lower Pyro monster from your deck to your hand. So cutting that off completely means they're not going to be able to get access to the Populace or the Snake Eyes Ash or whatever the heck they're trying to do. Every other deck is adding from the deck to the hand. Snake Eye Ash is integral to the Fire King combos. The Ponyx adds, you know, the Rescue Ace stuff adds, Pot of Prosperity adds, Populace adds. There's so many cards that add, so stopping them from adding sometimes is just so huge. And why this card is particularly better than Drone Lockbird going first is because Drone Lockbird, you have to wait till they're add already. So you're going for a neg 1 because you're losing the Drone Lockbird out of your hand. That's a card out of your hand. Your opponent doesn't neg at all because they're not spending cards, right? You're doing this on their action, in response to the action, not in response to a card. Whereas Mistaken Arrest going first, it activates in response to a card, and then it takes the 1-for-1 trade with that card. So even if they're not adding for the rest of the turn, you're still getting enough value out of the Mistaken Arrest, and you're not going neg 1 like Drone Lockbird, which sometimes can backfire if they're still able to put up somewhat of a board, right? Because they get the extra card in their hand. So that's just one thing to be wary of. But the thing with this card is you cannot really side it in effectively going second, whereas Drone Lockbird you can do. So I would probably think that this is the type of card that's independent of Drone Lockbird. You don't really compare them like apples to oranges more like. This is just a going first generically good card, whereas Droll is more of the hand trap that works going first or second. So you're not really comparable in my opinion. Next is another card, the spell card, the Gravekeepers Inscription. This card says at the start of your main phase 1, apply one of the following effects until the end of your opponent's turn. Neither player can activate card effects in the graveyard, so it's essentially Abyss Dweller. Neither player can banish cards from the graveyard, and neither player can special summon monsters from the graveyard. So against graveyard reliant strategies like Fire Kings, this is really effective because you're stopping up basically all of the Fire King effects that activate in the graveyard when they're destroyed, right? So they're not going to be using anything in the graveyard. And on top of all of that, if you're going second, second, you can actually shut off the Grunix that they have in the graveyard and the Promethean Princess that they have in the graveyard, so you can potentially start playing depending on whether your deck relies on graveyard-based combos, right? And another thing is you can actually stop cards like DD Crow or potentially the Bystials, which is just icing on the cake. I mean, the fact that it prevents your opponent from banishing is potentially useful in certain scenarios, so this is just a neat little card. The downside about this card is that you cannot use it in tandem with something like a Thrust, right? Because it says it has to be activated as your first action upon entering main phase 1, which means you literally have to hard open this. You can't search it. You cannot use it in response to something after you've activated a card. So this is your first action. So that might be something that your opponent can potentially play around because they know they're instantly under this card, and then they can kind of adapt their combos differently. But I mean, against Fire Kings, I don't know if they can necessarily do that because all of their interruption is based on the graveyard. So this is definitely the type of card that can do that. Another card that's very similar to Gravekeeper's Inscription, both effect-wise and lore-wise, is Necro Valley. This is a field spell, you know, going second. This is almost like a pseudo Mystic Mine against the right deck because it stops them from banishing cards and it stops any card effects in the graveyard that moves cards, you know, to a different place, which Fire Kings all do because they summon themselves back or they add back. So this is just something that you guys can definitely experiment with. And it's searchable off of Terraforming, which is searchable off of Thrust. So I don't know, potentially that's something that you can experiment with as well. Next up is none other than one of my favorite cards, Different Dimension Ground. This is a blanket card that says this turn, any monster sent to the graveyard is banished instead. Now, obviously, this is a go first card. It's a type of card that sets a restriction on your opponent that says, hey, you just cannot use the graveyard with your monsters. So that's highly effective against the right deck, right? Against Fire Kings, they're not going to be using their graveyard. They're not going to be able to dump the Grunix. They're not going to be able to use the cards like Snake Eyes Flamberg Dragon either, who gets the effect to resurrect 2 level 1 monsters when he's sent to the graveyard. And better yet, even cards like Populous are not going to be able to take advantage of their effects by putting itself back in the scale because it's going to be banished upon them linking it off or something like a Link Removal. And the nice thing about blanket cards like this is SP Little Knight just does not interact into them, right? Like we have floodgates that exist already, like Summon Limit or potentially, you know, Rivalry. There can be only one, all those guys at one. Well, SP Little Knight sometimes can just get rid of those cards. So it's nice that, you know, blanket cards just are not affected by removal. No Cosmic Cyclone. You just chain them to an effect and you get maximum value. So this is another card that you can definitely experiment with. And then I want to talk about the Snake Eyes stuff really quick because a lot of people are going to be playing the Snake Eyes engine for this upcoming year. The deck is just crazy, right? Like that engine is just super, super nuts. It does so much. But here are a couple of cards that you guys can actually experiment around with. And starting off with Sinful Spoils of Subversion Snake Eye. This is a spell that says target a face-up monster on the field. Place it face up in its owner's spell and trap zone as a continuous spell. This is especially useful because now that we're getting Populous, who actually allows you to add a Snake Eye spell or trap from your deck to your hand upon its summon, it means that if you have Populous and access to Diabellstar the Black Witch, Diabellstar just loses value because you're already going to be adding the original Sinful Spoils off of the Populous. So then Diabellstar is effectively only going to be able to set a Wanted because you only play 1 Sinful Spoils usually, right? Even if you play 2, you're not going to be able to activate it. So what's the point of setting it? But a card like this, Sinful Spoils of Subversion, going second could be useful because it turns your Diabellstar into a form of removal, potentially baiting a negate from your opponent by setting the Snake Eye, activating it, and then they're forced to kind of interact with it immediately, right? And in the cases where they don't actually interact, you can scale that monster, place it into the spell and trap zone, and then later summon something like a Flamberg if you're playing that, which I think you guys should because you can go off into Snake Eye Ash with this card. And then this card can actually resurrect a stoned monster. So a monster that you turn into stone with the Snake Eye spell card, you can instantly bring that back later on with the Flamberg Dragon. So that's just something that's really, really neat. You summon it to your side of the table. There's a lot of neat tricks that you can do with this card that I just think, you know, it's the type of card that should be sided in going second to leverage your entire engine because you're already playing 3 copies of Wanted, you're playing multiple copies of Bonfire and Populous. You're probably always going to be resolving these effects in some capacity or another because it's strictly better, in my opinion, to Ash something like the original Sinful Spoils for the most part, unless they're starting off with Snake Eyes Ash potentially. So a lot of times you will be getting to the Snake Eye Ash Populous, which means that Diabellstar is just like dead. It's just like an extender that you trade a card by discarding or sending from the field of the grave to, which is not great. But when you have Snake Eye in your deck as an option, it just opens up a lot more opportunities. So personally, I think it's great. Also going second is not much of a brick because you can just, if you draw it, you just activate it, right? It's just like a hard interruption against your opponent's monster. So it's kind of nice. And then going first with Diabellstar, another thing that you could do that a lot of the OCG players are actually doing is playing Snake Eyes Dramatic Chase and Snake Eyes, well, Sinful Spoils of Betrayal Silvera. So what do these cards do? Well, this is a new card, Snake Eye Dramatic Chase, coming out in Phantom Nightmare, that says place one Diabellstar monster from your hand, deck, or graveyard face up in your spell and trap zone as a continuous spell. So you would search your deck for Diabellstar, put her into the scale as a stone monster, and then in the end phase, there's actually a trigger effect that says during the end phase, you can banish this card from your graveyard, then target one monster treated as a continuous spell that you control, special summon it. So this is really, really nice because it means that you're effectively searching Diabellstar, right? But you're only going to be able to use this effect in the graveyard during the end phase to bring back that Diabellstar, who then triggers because she's special summoned, and then that allows you to set the Sinful Spoils of Betrayal Silvera. This is an existing trap card that is really, really powerful because it's effectively an Omni Negate. It's basically Hard Red Dragon Archfiend on a trap form. It says send one Diabellstar monster from your hand or face up field of the graveyard, then target one face-up card on the field, negate its effects. And then it has another effect in the graveyard which says when your opponent activates a card or effect in response to your Diabellstar monster effect or your Sinful Spoils for a trap card, you can banish this card from the graveyard, negate that opponent's effect. So it means they're not going to be able to use Ash Blossom on cards like the Wanted for the rest of the game or Sinful Spoils Original, which is really, really nice as long as you have in the graveyard. But better yet, this is effectively allows you to send the Diabellstar that you summoned off of the Dramatic Chase as a cost to negate anything that could pose a problem to you. So this is really, really powerful because you can negate a lot of powerful cards in this format like Evenly Matched, a lot of interesting monster effects that are trying to trigger. You know, you can negate their Snake Eyes monsters that they're trying to trigger on their end, like Snake Eyes Ash. It effectively makes it so Diabellstar the Black Witch becomes an Omni Negate on her own. And again, we kind of talked about how having Populace and Bonfire in rotation means that we're a lot of times we're still going to be able to resolve the Snake Eye anyways. So then our Black Witch is just like a additional extender that doesn't really do anything, but being able to play these cards means that you're able to either activate the Dramatic Chase, or better yet, in the case where you draw the Black Witch, you just summon her and then set the Silvera, so it's always kind of alive. So the only one brick that you're really playing is the Silvera, because this is a card that you don't really want to draw without access to the Black Witch, but then Dramatic Chase is just searching Black Witch, so it doesn't really matter. And then on top of all of that, there are other ways to get access to Black Witch, even if you don't have a personal Black Witch of your own, right? You have Dark, which can summon back an enemy Black Witch from their graveyard and then set the Silvera, so that could happen at any point during the grind game. And there's also cards like Selene, which allow you to resurrect your own Black Witch later on during the game in a grind game state, because Black Witch is actually a spellcaster. So this is just something really neat that the OCG discovered that I thought I would be sharing with you guys. And curious to hear your guys' thoughts. Do you guys think these cards are actually good in the Snake Eyes engine? Should we make the Snake Eyes a lot more bigger, or should it just be compact like it currently is, where you're just playing like the Sinful Spoils stuff that we already have and not really experimenting with the new cards? What do you guys think? Let me know in the comments below. Thanks a lot for tuning in as usual. And other than that, we'll see you all in the next video. Bye-bye.